Hi, this is Dr. Sovita Kirtani, Assistant Professor in the Department of Psychology of Parvati Bai Chogre College of Arts and Science. In this module, I will be talking about part 2 of structures of the brain and their functions. This is module number 8. In the 7th module, I had discussed part 1 of the structures of the brain and their functions, in which I spoke about the hindbrain, midbrain, and the forebrain. Well, you know that the forebrain is one of the most recent structures of the brain in the evolutionary scheme, with the cerebral cortex being the most recent one. The forebrain is that part of the brain which differentiates human brain from other brains of other animals. In this module, I will be talking about the cerebral cortex in particular, within which we will talk about the lobes, somatosensory cortex, and motor cortex. At the end of this module, students will be able to describe lobes of the brain and explain different functions of the lobes. The cerebral cortex is the largest structure in the forebrain. It is involved in thinking and planning. It is the most recently developed part of the brain in the evolutionary scheme and is made up of two halves called the cerebral hemisphere. In humans, the cerebral cortex is greatly convoluted with lots of grooves and bulges, which considerably enlarge its surface areas. You may wonder, what do these grooves and bulges do to enlarge the surface area? Imagine an area which has to be covered with a cloth. If you take an ironed out cloth and spread it on that area, you will probably have just that amount of the cloth. But if you have no restriction and you can fill in that area with a lot of cloth crumpled together, well, you have a larger piece of cloth now. That's exactly what happens with the cerebral cortex. Because it is convoluted with grooves and bulges, it has larger area in the same space. The cerebral cortex comprises the lobes, somatosensory cortex, motor cortex, and association cortex. It is involved in conscious experiences, voluntary actions, language, and intelligence. The cortex is called as the gray matter as it appears gray in color. This is because it is densely packed with mass of billions of cell bodies of neurons. The area of the cerebrum beneath the quarter inch of the cortex is called the white matter because it is composed of myelinated axons of the cortical neurons. The cerebral cortex is divided into two parts called as cerebral hemispheres. Both the hemispheres are divided into regions or lobes. You have the frontal lobe, you have the temporal lobe, parietal lobe, and occipital lobe. This is the area which is occupied by the lobes. The occipital lobe is located at the back of the head. It responds to visual stimuli. Different areas of the two lobes are connected to process information pertaining to color, shape, and motion. Well, when you study about the structure of the eye, you will probably at that point talk about how what your right eye senses travels to the left hemisphere. Where does it go in the left hemisphere? Well, it goes to the occipital lobe. What your left eye senses goes to the right hemisphere. Where does it go? It goes to the occipital lobe. And the two lobes, different areas in these lobes, are connected to process information pertaining to color, shape, and motion. It gives you a total perception of what you see. A stroke or wound in the occipital lobe can cause blindness or also wipe out a portion of the person's visual field. The temporal lobe is located just above the ears. It is involved in hearing, language processing, and memory. The temporal lobes have a number of connections with the limbic system. In the previous module, while talking about the limbic system, I had mentioned its role in filing memory. So the limbic system determines what information passing through the forebrain ought to be saved as memories. The temporal lobe has connection to the limbic system. It is no wonder then that people with damage to the temporal lobes cannot file experiences into long-term memory. The frontal lobe. Now, this is the portion of the cerebral cortex behind the forehead. It is involved in control of voluntary muscles, intelligence, and personality. So, people with damage to the frontal lobe are likely to have dramatically altered personality. People with faulty frontal lobe tend to be listless, insensitive to social context. They tend to have effect in a problem with their thinking processes. Now, the prefrontal cortex is involved in higher mental functions such as thinking and reasoning. The prefrontal cortex is a very important area of the frontal cortex, and it's involved in higher mental functions. Where is it located? Just behind the forehead. Ever got you thinking why we think like this? Well, that may be the answer. Now, a lot of neuroscientists refer to the prefrontal cortex as the executive control system because of its role in monitoring and organizing thinking. The frontal lobe in humans occupies a large area of the cerebral cortex as against the area in other animals. So in rats, there's practically no frontal lobe. In cats, it's about 3.5% of the cerebral cortex. In chimpanzees, it is 17%, whereas in human beings, the frontal lobe occupies 30% of the cerebral cortex. We now move on to the parietal lobe. This is located at the top and rear of each hemisphere. This is involved in registering spatial location. So when we have to judge how far to throw a ball to get it to someone, it is the parietal lobe which is in action. It registers attention when we shift attention from one activity to another. It's also involved in registering motor control. Stirring coffee in a mug would require the involvement of the parietal lobe. So we have the four lobes: parietal lobe, frontal lobe, temporal lobe, and occipital lobe. Both the hemispheres have all these lobes. We now move on to somatosensory cortex and motor cortex. The somatosensory cortex processes information about body sensations. It is located at the front of the parietal lobes. So if you see the green band there, it is the somatosensory cortex. The motor cortex processes information about voluntary movement. It's located just behind the frontal lobes. The red band talks about the motor cortex. It indicates the motor cortex. There is a point-to-point relation between a part of the body and a location on the cerebral cortex. What does this mean? Well, every part of the body is linked to one area of the cerebral cortex. And this is a point-to-point relation. So a specific area of the body is linked to a specific area of the cerebral cortex. This is needed for orderly and accurate perception of the world. For example, if something touches your lip, you know exactly which part of your body is being touched. This is because neural pathways from the lip travel to the area which is linked to the lip region of the cerebral cortex. The brain has more space for body parts that requires precision and control. Now, the cerebral cortex, or rather the sensory motor cortex, somatosensory and motor cortex, has certain region devoted to each of the body parts. But this is not determined by how big that body part is. So just because a torso is big or we have, long legs, that won't occupy much space in our brain. It is the face and hands which are capable of finer perceptions and movements, and therefore they require more cerebral cortex representation. With that, we come to the end of this module. I have a question for you. If one side of your brain is damaged, would it hamper the functions of the lobe, both lobes on both the sides of the hemispheres? Well, to find an answer to that, refer to these books which are mandatory. You could also go through these suggested readings. Thank you.